we'll have a more detailed introduction later. So what I'm going to say can serve as a light appetizer before the main course. So I have prepared 2 appetizers for you. The first one, in late 2019, Professor Hilpert delivered 10 lectures right here in this classroom. And the book was published and it became an instant bestseller. It sold out quickly. So today, I prepared 3 copies of books from the same series, not Professor Hilpert's book. And the book will be given to the first 3 students who ask questions later. Now, the second appetizer is Professor Hilpert has supported our journal for a long time. The cognitive semantics. That is this journal. And he is our main editor, one of our main editors. So with his involvement, the journal has been indexed by Web of Science. So I express my special gratitude to Professor Hilpert. Now, the main course. I invite our journal assistant, Zhe Gao, to have the full introduction. Yeah. Yeah, for the first 3 participants who asked questions, I remember that.
So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Innovation in Linguistics talk series presented by Journal Cognitive Semantics. I'm Zhe Gao from Beihang University and also an editorial assistant in this journal, COSE. I'm honored to host the second lecture in this series presented by Professor Martin Hilpert. And before we begin, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to our journal. Wait a second. Please. So Cognitive Semantics is a peer-reviewed international journal focusing on exploring the relationship between meaning and mind. We welcome submissions of unpublished research from all theoretical perspectives within linguistics. Thanks to the sponsorship from Beihang Universities, COSE has now transitioned to an open access journal. As a result, papers published in COSE are freely accessible to scholars all over the globe. So our founding editor and editor-in-chief is Professor Fuyin Thomas Lee from Beihang University. The journal's consulting editor, including Professor George Lakoff, Ronald Ecker, and Leonard Telmy. Our review editor is Professor Ed Fuyin, and our associate editor are Professor Martin Hilpert, today's speaker, and Professor Francisco Rose Mendoza, and Professor Veronica Cohen. And we are supported by a dedicated team of editorial assistants, including Dr. Liu Na from Central China Normal University, and Li Zifan, Yang Yuhang, and myself from Beihang Universities. And today, we are honored to welcome Professor Martin Hilpert to give a lecture, who is a professor of English linguistics at the University of Neuchâtel. He is interested in cognitive linguistics, language change, construction grammar, and corpus linguistics. And he is the author of the influential book, Construction Grammar and its Application to English. A key aspect of his research involved employing quantitative and corpus-based methods to analyze language. And we are delighted to welcome Professor Hilpert back to Beihang. His last visit in 2019 from China International Forum on Cognitive Linguistics, CIFCL, was highly memorable, particularly his 10 lectures on diachronic construction grammars. And that series provided us with profound cutting-edge insights, and later it is published by the same title. Professor Hilpert also plays a significant editorial roles in the academic community, serving as the editor of SSCI Journal Function of Language and as an associate editor for Cognitive Linguistics. Also, as I mentioned before, Martin is also an associate editor for Cognitive Semantics. As an editorial assistant, I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to him. His remarkable efficiency, dedication, and efforts as an editor has been key to enhancing our journal's academic standard and reputation. So now, without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Hilpert, who will now share his insight with us in his lecture, Competition between Construction and Lexeme-specific Variability. Let's go.
Okay, great. Is there a way I could see the slide on this screen too, or could I have that computer so that I could see the slides?
Okay.
Would that be okay?
You can see the slide on this.
Here. Okay. What about this one?
This is but you have to touch the screen here to
Okay.
change.
Okay. I'll touch the
Sorry
screen.
about that.
No, that's fine. That's fine. All right. So, okay. So this is just the.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Right. Thanks a lot for the invitation, for the warm introduction. And I'd like to start by saying that coming to Beihang University in 2019 and being invited for the 10 lecture, that is among the best things that have happened to me academically. So I've made so many friends, and I've made so many contacts that have lasted over the years. And I'm really, really happy to come back to this room and to see old friends, new friends, and to be able to talk to you. And I'd also like to greet everyone who is online. So thanks for spending time with me today. And I would like to give a talk about recent research of mine that I've been doing together with a PhD student. His name is Hikaru. I'll have a picture of him in just a second. All right. I hope that everyone can hear me all right. Okay, what is this talk about? I want to talk about the idea of constructional networks. So construction grammar as a theory holds that linguistic knowledge is organized in a network-like fashion with four meaning pairs that are connected to one another. And there is one major argument for this idea, namely that constructions are in competition with one another. So when we as speakers choose an expression, there are typically more than one alternative. So the expression that is most fitting for the thing that we would like to, for the idea that we would like to express is then chosen. So that suggests that alternative constructions are mentally connected in the speaker's knowledge of language. Now, the third point that you see here on the slide, lexeme-specific variability, what that refers to is that it's not only constructions that are connected to each other in the language network, but it's also constructions and words. And sometimes the words that appear in constructions exhibit somewhat unusual preferences, so that some words are either strongly attracted by a construction or conversely are strongly repelled by constructions. There's a case study that I brought that I want to use to illustrate how all of this works in practice. So I will be talking about English comparative constructions, which is a set of two constructions, one morphological, one periphrastic. Those two are in competition, and those two also exhibit different preferences with regard to the lexical items that appear within them. All right, so that is the general idea. Already mentioned that this is work that I've been doing together with Hikaru. Hikaru has been working with me at the University of Neuchâtel for some time now. And many of the things that I will say have come about through discussions that the two of us have had over the last months. Okay, so before I get started, I just want to say a few things in general about construction grammar. I've already made the main point that all of linguistic knowledge is seen as a network of four-meaning pairings. And you don't have to take my word for this. This is an idea that has been expressed by the foundational scholars of cognitive linguistics and construction grammar. Adele Goldberg has said this in one way. Ron Laneker has phrased the same idea in a slightly different way, but I just wanted to show you these quotes so that you know where the overall idea is coming from. Now, when researchers talk about constructions being connected, quite often what they are talking about are hierarchical networks where abstract constructions are connected to their more specific instantiations. So here is a graph that shows the connections between a very abstract syntactic construction that we could call the clause construction. And in English, but also in many other languages, well, that abstract construction could be instantiated by more specific clausal constructions, such as, for example, intransitive syntax, where a subject just combines with a verb, or a transitive construction where a subject combines with a verb and then an object. Now, and of course, those semi-abstract patterns could then be instantiated by more specific instances where we have concrete verbs, such as the intransitive verbs sleep and run, or transitive verbs such as kick or kiss. And so what this graph illustrates is that the abstract constructions are connected to ever more specific instances until we have fully specified concrete expressions that speakers also memorize and draw on when they use language. Okay, now here's a question question. Given that constructions are seen as being connected in a network, what happens when one construction is activated? Specifically, what happens to other constructions that are connected to this? And there's an idea that is not specific to construction grammar, but that is actually common to other approaches as well. So in many linguistic theories, it is assumed that language functions as a system where different parts are connected to each other. And so if one part is changed, other parts change with that part. In construction grammar, this has led to the idea that constructions are in competition with one another. And so that if one alternative is strengthened, an alternative can actually be weakened or driven out. And I've brought you a quote here from Hendrik de Smet and colleagues who expressed this idea. So I want to read this to you very quickly. So what Hendrik and his colleagues have said is that the relation between functionally similar forms, so forms that compete for attention that can express similar ideas, is often described in terms of competition. This leads to the expectation that over time, only one form can survive, that would be substitution, or each form must find its unique niche in functional space so that there would be differentiation. So if two constructions are doing the exact same thing, and one is repeatedly chosen over the other because it's more expressive or it's more convenient or there are cognitive advantages for it, then the other alternative might just disappear. Or, which is actually more common, the two constructions could take on slightly different functions so that they complement each other and that both actually serve a function. So that is what de Smet and colleagues call differentiation. Right, so this general idea is sort of my point of departure for this lecture. It's a valuable idea. It's an idea that I don't really want to take issue with, but I want to make the point that there's something more, okay? Namely, if we think about competition, we can ask ourselves at what level of abstraction that competition takes place. So the competition that Hendrik de Smet and colleagues have in mind is competition at the level of schematic abstract constructions that I've tried to illustrate here. So when we have the two comparative constructions of English, prouder and more proud. So an adjective with a morphological suffix, and then an adjective that is modified by more, that would be a classical level of competition. I see that there are a couple of comments in the chat. Should we check if there's a problem? Maybe. Is it okay? Okay, great. If there's any problem hearing me or anything else, please do let us know, put it in the chat. Okay, so competition at the level of abstract construction. Now, with regard to the two English comparative constructions, also the more specific instantiations of the two constructions could be in competition with one another. So, for example, the instantiations, prouder and more proud, are both possible. And so they can be in competition with one another. And likewise, when you have likelier and more likely, both of these are possibilities. And so they can also be in competition with one another. And that competition may be to some extent independent from the competition that is going on at the general level. And then, of course, either of the two schematic constructions have instances that do not compete because they are only or just in most cases assigned to one of the constructions. So if you have a very short adjective that is also very frequent, like hard, there it would be reasonable to say that this is actually not in competition with a corresponding specific construction for the periphrastic variant. Or when you have a long adjective such as difficult, more difficult doesn't face competition from a variant where you would put morphological affix at the end of the difficult. Right. So the question for me is, how do we describe competition that is not just on one level of the network, but that takes place at several different levels? Right. So that's what I try to summarize on this slide here. So the research questions that I have for this study that I'm going to present is what is the relation between constructional competition and lexeme-specific variability? And when can words actually deviate from the general competing tendencies that happen at the schematic level? So when can lexeme-specific tendencies override constructional competition? And then ask more broadly, what are the implications for a usage-based network model of linguistic knowledge? To give you an overview of the rest of this talk, so I'll first have to say a few things about the English comparative alternation. So the distinction between prouder and more proud, and then other adjectives that appear in that alternation. Then I'll talk about competition at the schematic level. So what is going on between the two general constructions? What are the factors that govern the alternation? Then I'll get into the issue of competition at the lexical level. So there, I actually don't just want to document that the two constructions have different lexical preferences. I'll try to find general principles that allow us to explain why there is lexical variability of the kind that we see in the data, and then I'll get to some concluding remarks. Okay, so let's start with the English comparative alternation. Here, I'm not telling you anything that will surprise you in major ways. So you're all aware that many English adjectives can form the comparative in two different ways. So when you have adjectives such as proud or funny or fresh, we can form the comparative either by adding a morphological suffix to get prouder and funnier and fresher, or we can put them in a periphrastic construction where they are modified by more so that we get more proud, more funny, and more fresh. And sometimes, even though from a prescriptivist perspective, people will say that, okay, that's not really conventional, that's not really adequate, but sometimes speakers actually do produce utterances such as it's more easier to see, where we combine the two. Right, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'll actually disregard the double variant and focus on the individual variants. And I want to know when and why speakers choose one variant over the other. Okay, there's no shortage of previous work. So there are many studies, in fact, that have addressed the English comparative alternation. And those studies have identified factors that have a role to play. And those factors come from virtually all levels of linguistic organization. So the most important level for the alternation is actually sound, phonology. And again, this won't be a surprise to you. The number of syllables is the most important variable in this. Yeah? So if all that your English teacher would have told you at some point is that, okay, for long adjectives, you use more, and for very short adjectives, you use the morphological ER affix, well, that's 90% of the problem. Yeah, so that's a very efficient way of getting most things right in a very, very short analysis. So everything that I will have to say is sort of expanding this to the last 10% of the variability. Yeah, so there's law of diminishing returns, but I hope that it's interesting nonetheless. Yeah, so number of syllables, but also the different sounds that characterize the adjectives, the final segments, the stress patterns of the adjective. Then the morphology, it has been argued that there's an effect that is independent and it goes beyond just length, so that two adjectives that might be the same in length but differ in morphological complexity might also show a different behavior with regard to the alternation. Then there are different syntactic variables that have been highlighted. So the syntactic context in which comparative construction appears also plays a role, for example, with regard to pre-modification. If I say a lot more expensive, that might play a role. Complementation, for example, with a following than construction, more expensive than the other one. There's also an argument that semantics plays a role, for example, with regard to degrees of relative abstractness or with regard to gradability. We'll see an example of that. And finally, there have also been studies that have addressed the pragmatics of comparative constructions. For example, when we really want to emphasize that something got more and more and more expensive. So that's a pragmatic effect. All right, so I want to get into all of these factors in a bit more detail. Starting with the number of syllables. So here you see a graph that basically summarizes what I've been saying a minute ago. And what you see in the graph is that there is a very, very clear tendency for very short adjectives and adjectives that are long, that is, that have 3 or more syllables. So the bars in the bar chart tell you that 1-syllable adjectives overwhelmingly take the morphological variant. So it looks like it's 100%. It's not quite 100%, but almost. And for adjectives that are 3 or more syllables long, you see that the bar is not even visible. So it's not quite 0%, but it's almost 0%. So the variation that we see is in the middle with the 2-syllable adjectives. And there we actually have some explaining to do. Why and when does a disyllabic adjective take the morphological construction or the periphrastic construction? Okay, but I'll get into the interesting 1% that is variable in either of the 2 categories on the borders, the 1-syllable adjectives and the longer adjectives. Moving on to the characteristics of the final segment. So the crucial sound variables that have been analyzed all concern the end of the word. So where the affix would attach. And there, for example, there are studies that tell us that 2-syllable adjectives that end, for example, in an L or an R or an E have a tendency to form the morphological variant. So, for example, humble, or gentle, those would be disyllabic adjectives that end in L. The studies don't always come to the same conclusion. So in the second bullet point here, you see that there are studies that have concluded that final R, for example, has the opposite tendency, so that it might favor the periphrastic variant rather than the morphological variant. And there's also a category of consonant clusters that has been argued to play a role. Sometimes it's not the final segment by itself, but really a sequence of final segments. So there are studies that tell us that, for example, adjectives ending in E versus Li, behave in different ways. So, for example, sticky would just be a final E, and friendly would be a final L and then an E. And even though those two have the same final element as such, they would show slightly different tendencies. Then the last sound variables that I want to talk about have to do with stress patterns of words. So, for example, disyllabics with final stress, such as remote or severe, they're stressed on the second syllable, they have a bias towards the periphrastic variant. And stress is not only relevant in the word itself, in the adjective itself, but rather it is also relevant in the broader context of words that follow the adjectives. So English has a prosodic pattern where speakers try to achieve an alternating pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. And so if we want to avoid having two stressed syllables in a row, we can actually use the morphological affix to achieve that. Yeah? So for example, a more fresh salad has two stressed syllables in a row. And if we say a fresher salad, that allows us to achieve the wavy up, down, pattern that avoids stress clash. I'm moving on to morphological complexity. So here we see a contrast between adjectives such as careful or partial, which have two morphemes, and adjectives such as gentle or humble, which have the same final element. So sound-wise, they're quite similar, but morphologically, they're simpler. And here we have studies observing in actual corpus data that greater morphological complexity leads to a greater tendency toward periphrastic constructions. Okay, I know this is a lot, but bear with me. I'm moving on to syntax. So here we're looking at the contexts in which comparative constructions can appear. And the first syntactic contexts that have been studied concern comparative constructions in with two infinitive complements, where we come across examples such as some of these are more easy to exploit than others, which should strike you as a little bit unusual, because easy as an adjective is very frequent, and when we look at its distribution, it typically takes the morphological comparative, easier, right? So here, the speaker chooses something different, more easy to exploit. And there's a reason why this makes sense. When we have an expression such as easy to exploit, that is a quite frequent expression that can become a chunk that is holistically processed. And so when I have the idea easy to exploit and I want to strengthen that, I want to put that in a comparative, I have the choice between more easy to exploit, which leaves the chunk intact, and easier to exploit, which breaks up the chunk and introduces morphological affix in the middle of it. Right? And that is something that speakers actually try to avoid. Yeah? And so that's why we end up with, let's say, unusual comparatives in cases with a two infinitive. Now, you are aware that adjectives in English can be used in attributive constructions and predicative constructions. Attributive constructions would have the adjective in front of a noun, so modifying a noun, for example, in a saltier taste. Predicative constructions have the adjective following the noun phrase and the copular verb. For example, in the taste is more salty. And here, when we look at corpus data, we can actually see that there's a difference with regard to the relative preferences of the two constructions, so that attributive usage correlates with a higher ratio of morphological comparatives, and predicative usage correlates with more periphrastic comparatives. And then finally, I've already mentioned the following then. Yeah. And here, in the existing studies, the jury is still out, so the data don't look particularly clear, even though people have made guesses. Yeah. And with regard to pre-modification as an a lot nicer or much more expensive, here the evidence indicates that it introduces a Okay, great. So what I want to add to this picture are variables that don't have well, a representation with regard to linguistic structure, but that have to do with language use, so with frequency. There are two frequency effects that I want to talk about, which have to do, well, let me start like this. So when we compare adjectives that are very frequent to adjectives that are less and less frequent, we see that highly frequent adjectives have a stronger tendency to form the morphological comparative. So on this table here, you see three adjectives, namely easy, noisy, and choosy. So easy is an adjective that you recognize as a very, very frequent adjective. Noisy, okay, that's also a common word, but not as common. And choosy is even less common, okay? And that you see in the first column of the table, the general frequency of the basic form of the adjective. And that frequency, that actually correlates with the rate of morphological comparatives. So easy forms the morphological variant in 99% of all cases. With noisy, it's still more than 80%. And with choosy, well, there it's actually less than half. So frequency has something to do with the way speakers choose between the two variants. And then the second frequency effect, you could argue, is really a semantic effect that has to do with degrees of gradability. So in English, the distinction between gradable adjectives and non-gradable adjectives has to do with the fact whether you can imagine the adjective as describing a quality that's on a continuum, on a climb. So something like correct and incorrect is not gradable. You know, if you solve a math problem, it's either right or it's not right. There's no gray area in between. You know? Even though the teacher might say, well, you tried, and you know, it's almost, it's not quite as wrong as other potential solutions. But something like heavy, for example, something can be a little bit heavy, very heavy, or just too heavy to pick up. You know? And again, we can look at adjectives that sound similar and look at their gradability, their ability to evoke the idea of a climb. You know? And so there, I would ask you to look at the second table and maybe start with the third adjective, humble. Someone can be a little bit humble or very humble or so modest, you know, it's the peak of humility that they are. And so that is a very gradable adjective. With stable, well, it's maybe a little less. Yeah. So either a bridge can be stable or it can be shaky. Yeah. And of course, it can get shakier and shakier, but maybe not quite the same as humble. And with able, there would be grounds for saying that, okay, either you can do it or you cannot do it. Either you can swim or you can't. So that would be less gradable than stable and humble. And again, when we have this kind of gradability, we see that it maps onto the tendency for the adjectives to form comparatives in the morphological way. So humble forms the morphological variant more than 70% of the time. For stable and for able, it's a lot less. Okay, so And we can measure gradability by comparing how often a verb is used in an adjective is used in its basic form, and how often speakers form comparatives on the basis of it. So for able, we simply do not find that many comparatives, even though as a general adjective, able is quite frequent. All right, so I wanted to mention these frequency effects because they complement the structural variables that we see in a very useful way. Right, so on this table here, you see a summary of everything that I've said so far. So I've given you a broad overview of the variables that influence speakers' choices when they're faced with the alternatives of a periphrastic or a morphological comparative. And the way the table breaks down is that the first four variables have to do with sound, with phonology. Then we move on to just one variable that has to do with morphology. The following ones have to do with syntax, and then at the end, we have the frequency-related variables. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about competition at the schematic level of the abstract constructions. So this is moving into the empirical part of my talk. And here I want to first talk about a study that I did that Hikaru and I have built on. So the study is based on data from the British National Corpus, which is a large general purpose corpus. And at the time, I extracted all morphological comparatives and all periphrastic comparatives from the corpus. And you see that that gave me quite a lot of examples, so almost 80,000 examples in total. And those 80,000 examples, they cover almost 250 different adjective types. So proud and easy and likely and so on and so forth. And I annotated all of those examples in terms of the two variants, so morphological, periphrastic, and then the 11 explanatory variables that I presented to you. So for an example such as that's far more likely now, the annotation would be such that we know that it's a periphrastic comparative. We know that likely has 2 syllables. We know that its final elements is an L and an E, and so on and so forth. So for all the variables that I've discussed, the information is there. And then that kind of data can be analyzed with methods such as logistic regression, which is a method that tries to model the outcome of a binary choice through several explanatory variables. So a classic statistics textbook example would be if we're trying to predict whether or not somebody owns their apartment or they're renting it, we could try to explain that through factors such as how old are they, what is their gender, how much money do they earn, do they have children, etc., etc. So given a data set that holds information about these variables, we can determine whether or not a variable really affects the probability of owning a home. So for example, the question whether people, let me think of something. So people, whether people have pets, for example, that might make a difference, okay? Because it's more difficult to have pets in a rented apartment. But something, whether people like to drink alcohol or not, that might not make a difference. So this kind of reasoning. And an additional bonus is that a regression model on the basis of one data set can then be applied to a different data set so that we can see how generalizable our insights actually are. Okay, So if we try to explain how home ownership works in one city and then we apply it to a different city, and there we notice that, okay, it doesn't quite explain the facts in the same way with the same degree of accuracy, then our analysis might actually have to be revised so that we include further variables. Okay, why is this method appropriate here? Well, it's appropriate because the alternative that we're looking at is clearly a binary one, so it's either one or the other. And we know that many variables enter the decision in a gradient way. So it's not an either or kind of thing, but rather it's a tendency that is introduced. So when there's a following to infinitive that holds people in one direction just a little bit, but it's not a determinant factor. And the method is also appropriate because we want to learn about the relative importance of multiple factors that are at work simultaneously. And that is what this method can do. Yeah. And in terms of results, for each explanatory variable, the method gives us a number of pieces of information. So it tells us whether or not there is a significant effect. So it gives us p-values that represent that. It gives us information about the direction of any effect that is measured. So does the variable hold people towards the morphological variant or rather towards the periphrastic variant? And with what strength does it do that? Yeah, so I'll get into all of these points in more detail in just a second. And additionally, the results show us how much of the observed variation we can actually explain. So we will have a sense of do the variables that we've put into the model actually explain a large portion of the variability, or are there more variables that we would need to take into account? Yeah? And does the overall model give us a significant improvement over just guessing whether people choose one variant or the other? Right. Okay. So I'm afraid we're getting to the part of the talk where I need to show you lots of numbers. I'm afraid this table is not much to look at in this way, but I'll walk you through the individual parts bit by bit so that you understand exactly what is meant by the individual elements. Yeah? So quite generally, what we have in the first column where it says variable, those are the variables that we talked about. So number of syllables, the final sound elements, etc., etc. Then we have in the second column where it says coefficients, the direction of the effect. So positive number indicates that people prefer the periphrastic variant, so positive periphrastic, and minus morphological. So if you can just use that as a strategy. The column that says odds ratio that describes the size or strength of the effect, and then the final column gives you the p-value that indicates statistical significance. So small numbers indicate that there is a significant effect, and numbers that are larger than 0.05 indicate, or close to 0.05 indicate that, well, maybe there's not that much of an effect going on. Yeah. And so one first thing that you can see in the third column is that most of the variables actually have an effect. Okay, so previous research has been on the right track, largely, yeah, but we'll get into that in more detail. So let me go through the table bit by bit, starting with the number of syllables. So, and this is reassuring news because we get a significant effect, a very high odds ratio, indicating that this is really the strongest effect that we have in the data set. Yeah? And this is not surprising. This is just reassuring that the method actually picks up on this and tells us that the more syllables there are, the higher the likelihood of a periphrastic comparative. Right. moving on to the final sound elements. So here I've highlighted two of the different elements that I have annotated for. So you see that final L and final Li both have a positive coefficient, meaning that they introduce a bias towards the periphrastic variant. And they do so with quite high odds ratios so that there is an effect that is larger than, for example, final E or final consonant cluster. Now, so those values we can actually compare against one another, indicating that, okay, L and Li, they drive the variation more so than other sound elements that we could consider. Stress also has an effect, and in the expected direction, so in the direction that was initially proposed by earlier research. So final stress, like adjectives like remote or severe, introduce a bias towards the periphrastic comparative. Moving on to morphology. Oh, no. First, there's a second stress variable. However, it has no effect. So here, the method tells us something that has been proposed in earlier research on closer inspection actually turns out not to have the effect that was proposed. And here, I should add that all the previous studies that I've talked about looked at these variables in isolation. So just at one variable at one time, so the so-called monovariate analyses. And when we do that, when we look at variables in isolation, it could be that we are seeing an effect that is not due to that variable by itself, but rather it's due to another variable that we're not controlling for at this point in time. Yeah, so an advantage of these multivariate methods is really that they allow us to look at the effects of different methods at the same time so that we control for everything else that is going on. And in this case, it shows us that the initial stress of the right colloquy does not have the statistical effect that we would expect to see. Okay, now we're moving on to morphology. And here, quite reassuringly, it actually looks like there is an effect of morphological complexity above and beyond just length. Yeah, the two, of course, correlate. Longer adjectives are more likely to have more morphemes in their structure. With regard to syntax, here's the more easy to see example. Yeah? So I've already given you the explanation that there's chunking going on with expressions such as easy to exploit or easy to see. And that is sufficient for the statistical model to pick up on this tendency and to register an effect in the expected direction. With regard to attributive and predicative usage, we also see an effect in the expected direction. So you see that attributive has the minus sign, so it goes with the morphological comparative, and predicative has the positive sign, so it goes with the periphrastic comparative. The effects are not particularly large, but they're clearly there, so they come out of the data. Following then works in the way that was suggested. So following then introduces a bias towards the morphological comparative. So things like heavier than I thought are found in the data and lead to this result. Okay, pre-modification also has a significant effect, so that it introduces a bias towards the periphrastic comparative. So when we have something like a lot in front of the comparative, speakers have a tendency to use the variant with more rather than the morphological variant. That brings us almost to the end, to the to frequency effects. And the model includes them so that high positive frequency goes together with the morphological comparative, and the decline of gradability, so a high ratio of comparatives, also introduces a bias towards the morphological comparative. Okay, sorry, this was a lot. So now you know more about the comparative alternation than 99.999% of the population on Earth, and probably more than you ever need. But let me summarize what I've said. So with the exception of stress clash, all factors make a significant contribution. And with the exception of the following then, all effects also are in the expected direction. Yeah, so that is good news. It indicates that previous work has been largely on the right track, even if that work just looked at the variables in isolation. And unsurprisingly, the number of syllables is the variable with the strongest effect on the alternation. Okay. When you have a statistical model like this, you can assess the quality and the the question of whether you've really captured a significant amount of variability. And here, the indicators of model quality tell us that we have actually captured a good amount of the variability that is there in the data. So on the slide, you have a table of the observed and predicted examples. And you see that the model is very good at guessing morphological comparatives. It's a little less good at classifying the periphrastic examples correctly. But overall, we have an accuracy of more than 95%, which looks really, really impressive. But then at the same time, you have to keep in mind that the data set consists of 89% morphological comparatives. So any model would have to be better than that to really be useful. Yeah, but that is something that is a given here. Yeah, something that I want to point out is that language use matters to the alternation. So both frequency measures show the expected effect. And that means that language structure is really not all there is to the comparative alternation. Language use is critical as well. The question, of course, is how critical? And also here, the method allows us to have an assessment of that. So we can test the relative importance of sound variables, syntactic variables, and also the frequency factors. And we can do that by constructing alternative models that simply disregard the portion of the variables that I have described. Well, thank you so much. So on this slide, you see a table where I have 3 different models. One model that disregards all the sound variables, one model that disregards all the syntactic variables, and one model that disregards all the frequency variables. And what you see is that when we exclude all the variables that have to do with sound, we are basically falling back to chance level. Okay, so the model A without phonology is not much better than what we would just guess. Yeah, if we would guess morphological all the time. If we disregard the syntactic information, we're actually not that much worse than the full model. And if we disregard frequency information, we're also almost at the same level. So what we could say is that sound is really driving the alternation, and syntax and frequency are fine-tuning it. So that's information that's nice to have. But for example, it wouldn't really make sense for a second language teacher to go over all of these variables in detail in order to teach the students to use the 2 comparatives in this way. It would only fine-tune the accuracy in very minor ways. All right. Now, I'm coming to the third part of my talk in just a second, but before I do, let me explain another way to critique statistical models of this kind, and that would be to confront the model with new data. So if an analysis that is based on one corpus only poorly predicts what's going on in other corpora, we may need to revise the model. Yeah? And so for this particular data set, I chose a test candidate that was very different from the BNC, namely a corpus that is based on European Parliament proceedings. So the BNC consists of all kinds of different texts, written, spoken, different kind of text genres. And the European Parliament proceedings, well, it's only one text genre. It is typically written to be spoken. So people, the parliamentary members prepare their speeches, and then they, well, say things about laws and trade regulations and political issues. Yeah. So it's very different in terms of genre, range of topics, and the way, the modality in which it is delivered. So I thought if the BNC data holds up for that, that is actually a good indication of generalizability. Yeah. So I retrieved the same data from the Europower corpus and then applied the BNC analysis. And the result is basically good news. So we get classification accuracies that are encouraging, even though they're not quite as good as the original model on the basis of the BNC. Yeah. And what you see in the table on this slide is that, again, the model is very good at guessing the morphological comparatives, but it is less good at guessing the periphrastic ones. And if you look here on the table, you might say that, wait, it's really only guessing 50-50. Isn't that terrible? Well, it's not so terrible if you consider that there are 90% morphological comparatives. So it would be really terrible if the model got only 10% correct and 90% wrong. Yeah, so 50% correct is already a big improvement. Okay, enough of this. Let's take stock. So previous analyses have correctly identified many, if not most, factors that govern this particular alternation at the schematic level. And by not taking a bird's eye view and considering all of these variables together, we can build a model that quite accurately captures what speakers are doing. I've said multiple times that phonological variables are the most important ones. And the model also classifies unseen data with reasonably good accuracy. Okay, we might say, why do we see this particular constellation of factors? So what we have up to this point is really an accurate description, but what does it tell us? Can it explain why speakers are doing what they're doing? And there have been arguments to the effect that the variables also fall in line with the notion of complexity. So there is an idea that is known as the complexity principle, which captures that linguistic structures that are more transparent and more explicit are favored in speech situations that are cognitively complex. So whenever the speaker has difficulties communicating, either because the room is quite noisy or they don't know their interlocutor very well and what they know and what they do not know, or they're talking about a delicate subject. Yeah? So whenever there are communicative challenges, so to speak, speakers will prefer constructions that are more transparent, more explicit, more analytic. And in this case, that more transparent variant would be the periphrastic one, okay? Because there's an extra word that signals to the viewer, all right, here comes a morphological, a periphrastic construction. And there are factors that corroborate this view, in fact. Yeah? So more syllables or more morphemes in an adjective mean that there is more to process for the hearer. So the least that the speaker can do is to make the hearer's life a little bit easier and choose the periphrastic variant. Yeah. Or if we imagine that there's a heavy syntactic complementation, there's extra stuff to process. Again, we can make the hearer's life a little easier by choosing the periphrastic construction so that the more is an explicit signal that is easier to hear than the morphological affix. Likewise, the frequency effects point in the direction of complexity playing a role. So low frequency adjectives are not as easily processed, no? And so there's an argument for picking the periphrastic variant. If we want to take a low gradability adjective and put it in the comparative, now, so in a concept like able and make it comparable, that is a somewhat unusual idea. So we can signal to the hearer that, look, we're doing something slightly unusual now, and that can be achieved through the periphrastic construction more so than the morphological construction. Okay, so I've tried to sell this idea, but there are also points that detract from it. Now, so if complexity is all there is, why do we see the differences between final sounds that don't seem to have to do anything with complexity? So why opposing tendencies for final E and final L? Can we explain this in terms of complexity? Someone might try. I can't. Why does the following then favor the morphological variant rather than the periphrastic variant? So there you might find an ad hoc explanation saying that, okay, then actually makes things more explicit and more transparent, and so we don't need the more variant. But I find that these kinds of explanations get circular very quickly. So you just, if people avoid something, then okay, they must avoid this because it's too complex. And if they do it, it's because that helps them avoiding complexity. But more importantly, if complexity is really all there is, why do we see idiosyncratic, unpredictable behavior of individual words at all? Yeah. If complexity was really the only factor that drives everything, then there should not be unpredictable lexical effects. And I want to turn to those now. Yeah? So competition at the lexical level. And here I come back to an important idea in construction grammar, namely redundant representations. So this relates to the network graph that I showed you earlier. In our knowledge of language, the representations are not maximally economical. So we store general patterns, but we also store specific instantiations. So consider a past tense form like walked. Now, you know the verb walk, and you know how the past tense is formed in English, meaning that you wouldn't have to memorize the form walked by itself. Now, you could just take walk and apply the grammatical rule. But there's a lot of experimental evidence that shows us that speakers actually do represent walked as a word form that we memorized as such. And this concerns not just complex word forms, but even phrasal units such as I don't know, or even longer stretches like all over the place or things like that. So given that there are these redundant representations, it stands to reason that speakers represent individual comparative forms such as wealthier or more mature. So those are things that we remember in their own right. And there we can ask what this implies about the competition between the morphological variant and the periphrastic variant at the schematic level. So can these redundant representations actually explain why some lexemes show tendencies that deviate from the factors that operate at the general level of competition between constructions. So I find it useful to think about this kind of situation as emancipation, so that there are individual specific forms that become emancipated, that become independent from the general schema. You know, if we remember them as units in their own right, they may start to do their own thing. Okay, like children that grow into adults and become independent of their parents. So something similar is going on here, and I want to illustrate this with some adjectives that show idiosyncratic distribution. So, for example, the adjectives costly and deadly and likely behave in ways that are different from lively, lovely, and ugly, which, sound-wise, they're similar. They all have the final "ly," but costly and deadly and above all likely, they have really strong preferences for the periphrastic variant. And we see the opposite for lively and lovely and ugly. And we can ask ourselves, okay, why is that? Why don't they just fall in line with the general factors? Well, when we look at easy and happy and heavy, we have disyllabic adjectives that exhibit really extreme skews. So that, for example, for happy, we have a factor of 10 to more than 1,000. And for heavy, it's even stronger. So this is something that really bothered my PhD student, Hikaru. And he said, look, we need to do something about this. We need to address this problem and find out what is driving this variation. So he proposed that we reanalyze the data with a statistical technique that is still similar to the logistic regression that I showed you, but that can take these idiosyncrasies into account. So this is something that you may be familiar with, namely mixed effects, or also called multi-level modeling, where we account for fixed effects, as the explanatory variables that I presented to you earlier, but at the same time, we also account for so-called random effects, which capture the variability at the level of individual lexical elements. So the preferences of individual adjectives can be taken into account, and instead of just averaging over them, which would be done in the model that I presented to you earlier, their differences actually become part of the model. So they turn into information rather than noise. Okay, how does this work in specific ways? I need to make a distinction, a terminological distinction, between two kinds of predictors, namely token level predictors and group level predictors, because these are treated differently in mixed effects analysis. So token level predictors are variables such as the choice between attributive and predicative constructions, or the presence or absence of a falling to infinitive, or the initial stress or non-stress of the right colloquy. Those things can be different for the same adjective. So one adjective, like easier, can be followed by a to infinitive, or it can be followed by a different syntactic context. For group level predictors, that's not that's the opposite, actually. Yeah. So group level predictors work in such a way that for any given adjective, all examples have the same value. So easy always has two syllables. Easy always ends with an E. Yeah. It's important to make this difference because the adjectives in the data set, of course, differ in how many examples they contribute to the analysis. So the adjective small, for instance, appears more than 8,000 times. And by contrast, an adjective such as vile appears only 3 times in the data set. Yeah? So this means if we don't distinguish between group level and token level predictors, that means that small has a much, much larger effect on certain variables than vial. Yeah, so it's like small gets to vote more than 8,000 times, and vial only gets to vote 3 times. So this can distort how the model estimates the importance of variables, such as the final phonological segment. Yeah, so it could theoretically be that we have one adjective that behaves in a very unusual way that is really frequent. Yeah, and so it draws all the other adjectives with it, even though they behave in very different ways. So this can be handled, this kind of data can be handled by a multi-level model, so that it counts each adjective type just once if it is a group level predictor. Yeah. Okay. Now, we already looked at the table of results for the first statistical model earlier. So here, we don't have to go through the table line by line by line, but I still want to show you the table because the good news is that the predictors come out in very much the same way as in the earlier model, with 2 exceptions. And those exceptions are highlighted in yellow here. So finally, which came out as a strong predictor in the model I presented to you earlier, is no longer significant. So what you see here is that it has a p-value that actually tells you, look, there's nothing to see here. Yeah, it's not significant. And also the number of morphemes that was significant in the model that I showed you is no longer significant. But the rest of the variables, they maintain the significance of their effect, they maintain the direction of their effect, and they also maintain the magnitude of the effect more or less. Okay, so there are some finer differences that we could talk about, but generally, so this new analysis doesn't change fundamentally the interpretation of the earlier, more basic analysis, but it can account for new data, and that's what I want to come to now, by showing you the adjectives that have tendencies that really deviate from the general competition between the 2 schematic constructions. So, for example, you see that likely has a very, very strong bias toward the periphrastic variant, more so than we would expect just based on its general characteristics. Real has a very strong bias towards the periphrastic variant. And that is surprising given that it's a short adjective, right? It's monosyllabic. And there are a couple of others that we could also talk about. But the main point here is that we can take these idiosyncrasies into account and make them part of the model and have a more reliable assessment of what the competition at the general level actually looks like. I also want to show you the opposite end of the spectrum, where we have adjectives that show an unexpected bias towards the morphological variant. And here, what's interesting is that we actually see the very few 3-syllable adjectives that still appear with the morphological variant a couple of times in the data set. So, for example, untidy, yeah, or unhappy. People say untidier or unhappier, and you can probably imagine why they do. Yeah, it's because tidy and happy are frequently used with a morphological variant. So it's tidier and happier. And so again, it's an effect of chunking because the presence of the chunk happier and tidier is so strong that we can see that being prefixed by un. That leads speakers to produce morphological examples in spite of the fact that this gives them a very, very long morphological word in the end. Okay, right. So why do we see these lexical idiosyncrasies? There's one important factor namely frequency. So this is a third frequency effect in the data set. When Hikaru and I looked at the data, it turns out that we saw that frequency of an adjective in the comparative correlated with its degree of choosing either one variant or the other. And there's a graph that I want to show you that looks like this. It looks quite complex when you first see it, but let me explain what's going on in this graph. So on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we have frequencies of the adjectives in the comparative construction. Yeah? So a form such as great, which you see in the lower right corner, is very frequently used in the comparative construction. Or if you look very, very high up, there you see likely in the upper right corner. So likely is also very frequently used in the comparative construction. So in both variants, right? Now, the y-axis, the vertical axis, shows the proportion of the periphrastic form. So adjectives that are high up have a strong preference for more, and adjectives that are far down have a strong preference for the morphological variant. And so something like gross has a strong preference for ER, yeah? And something like obscure has a strong preference for the more variant. Okay, and now for the obvious thing. You see that the dots are distributed across the graph in a very striking horseshoe-like pattern. Yeah, so there are points here and here and here, but here there's a large area that is conspicuously empty. Okay, so actually put a little visualization of a tumbleweed tumbling through the emptiness of that part of the graph. So frequent adjectives in the comparative are radicalized. They're either one or the other, okay? So we don't have frequent adjectives in the comparative that can do both, yeah? And well, that actually makes sense, yeah? When you think about something like more likely or greater, those are redundant representations that have become emancipated from the overall pattern of the competition between comparatives at the schematic level, and they are remembered in their own right. Yeah? So when I say more likely, I'm not computing the qualities and characteristics of the adjective likely and how adjectives usually behave in the comparative alternation. I just remember the thousands of instances of more likely that I've heard in the past of my language experience. Yeah? So it's entrenchment of these forms that leads to independence from the general pattern of competition between the two comparatives. So in conclusion, when we look back at the network of constructions and at the issue of competition, there is competition going on at multiple levels of abstraction. So the statistical model tells us that when speakers form comparatives, there are factors that lead them to make this choice, yeah, according to a number of principles that are quite complex, that involve phonology, morphology, syntax, and language use. Yeah? But at the same time, there is also competition going on at lower, more specific levels. And the constructions that are at lower levels become more idiosyncratic the more strongly they are entrenched, the more strongly they have become emancipated from their parent construction. So you could say that the more frequent something like likelier or more likely gets, the less of a link we have between them and the parent construction. Yeah? So this is something that could be modeled in a network analysis that takes the dynamic nature and diachronic development into account. Okay, so it makes sense to think of variability as a client where we have the morphological comparative, the periphrastic comparative, and an area of overlap where adjectives are fully variable. Yeah? So that will be disyllabic adjectives that are not very frequently used in either of the two constructions, where it's really the general factors that govern speakers' choices. Then towards the outer areas of the mutual overlap, we have adjectives that vary a little bit, but not that much. And also for both constructions, we have adjectives that are not variable at all, no, that are just fixed in their outcome. And frequency affects the strength of bias. So the more frequently an adjective is observed in the comparative construction and is observed not to vary, yeah? The more strongly it becomes emancipated from the general factors that govern the competition between the two constructions. And I just want to end on this idea, which resonates with what I've been saying so far, the idea of statistical preemption, which means that speakers know which forms are potentially in competition, and they keep track of which variant is winning. Now, and so if they observe that speakers produce more likely, even in contexts where likelier would have been more appropriate given the contextual factors, yeah? And in spite of that, speakers still produce more likely, then they will end up inferring that, wait, there has to be some kind of convention that it's really more appropriate to say more likely rather than likelier. Yeah? So it hasn't quite gotten to the fact where, as a speaker of English, you cannot say likelier. That's possible. Yeah? It's just something that speakers will try to avoid or try to shy away from. Yeah? Of course, not consciously, but just as a general consequence of their experience with language. All right, so I want to leave you with this thought and come to a general conclusion. So understanding how speakers choose between alternative expressions requires us to view knowledge of language as a network. And schematic constructions and specific constructions compete against one another. And both general probabilistic factors and conventionalized idiosyncrasies influence speakers' choices. And figuring out how the relative impacts of these general factors and more specific idiosyncrasies work together, that I think is a very interesting topic where the last word definitely hasn't been spoken yet. All right, so with that, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank Hikaru. I would like to thank everyone online. I hope that everything was audible, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Before we enter the discussion section, Beihang, could you please report the size of audience for Hilpert?
There are 39 audience in Zoom now.
And another Chinese staff meetings, and so we have to do this. So thanks, Professor Hilpert, for today's lectures. He has made already a take-home message here, so I will only make a short summaries. And Martin first started from the previous studies, including the variables that influence the comparative constructions and of English, and later he moved on to his own research on how he built a model, a regression model that not only considers all variables by isolation, but as a multi variables that consider how these variables are work together. And for the third part, he introduced another new perspective of lexical variability and also the redundant representation to show that why there are some examples that behave extremely different than the others, or that it's the exception except from the neural models. So now let's enter the Q&A sessions. Since we have offline and online and offline audience, so we will take one by one around. So also, Thomas has bring us 3 gifts, and we will only give them to our offline audience. So sorry about that. So let's start.
Hi, Martin.
Yeah.
Thank you for wonderful talk. It's a lot of work. Then I have a question considering the selection of variables. It seems you only consider the variables at the formal level, and sure for such kind of constructions, semantic variables. It seems this not work. But you mentioned one which is a little bit semantic, that is gradability.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, we didn't consider that, right? Gradability in our variables.
Yes, so the gradability, the semantic effect of gradability is captured by the second frequency effect. Let me go back to the slides.
Okay. This
Oh,
is
yeah,
controlled by this.
Okay.
This
Okay. Wait a second. Well,
what? This is
yeah, we need to go all the way back. Oops.
Sorry. Okay, now it's back to
Okay.
It responds.
Further down.
This one?
Almost.
Oh.
Too many slides. Okay, here we are. Okay, so the effect of meaning is operationalized as a frequency effect of the ratio of the frequency of an adjective in its basic form and the frequency with which comparative constructions appear in the same corpus. So what this ratio tells me is that there are lots and lots of instances of the adjective able, and less than 0.1% of those are comparative forms. So semantically, that tells me that able is not something that is comparable very much. Yeah. When we compare that to humble, yeah. So more than 10% of all forms that involve humble are actually comparatives. So semantically, humble is a lot more. It lends itself a lot more easier. A lot more easier. It lends itself more easily to the semantic procedure of being compared. Yeah. So you're right to ask the question. Wait, but did you take meaning into account? What I measured is really just a frequency effect. But I want to argue that these frequency ratios actually capture a semantic criterion, namely how easy it is to construe an adjective as being on a climb or expressing quality that's on a climb. Will you agree, or do you see that critically?
Yes. It makes sense, but it seems in the variables, I don't know, according to my intuition as a second speaker of English, something is missing. Like you mentioned the complexity principle that is related to our cognitive load when we learn this word and when we try to use the comparative form. So from my perspective, it seems it's better to add another variable from the psychological perspective.
Okay.
Maybe that variable will play a more important role. Okay, if we compared with the other variables.
Okay.
I don't know if that's right. It's just a hypothesis.
Okay, and you're thinking of a variable that has to do with a particular kind of meaning or with complexity as such. So, are you thinking of a measure of semantic complexity that would reflect the semantic complexity of a meaning of like humble or able? How easy it is to conceptualize that?
Something like that. I'm not sure yet, but it's just in mind.
Okay. That's a great suggestion, in fact. I'll keep that in mind. And okay. So in other work of mine, I have employed semantic variables a lot more than here. Yeah. So here, semantics has taken something of a back seat because, the alternation is really driven by phonology. It's just, in that sense, you might say it's a little boring as an alternation. It's not like, for example, the dative alternation, which is very, very meaning-based and information structure-based. And other alternations in English that are based on things like animacy and meaning factors, or when you have different causative constructions where I've talked about force dynamics in another talk. So those are things that really are close to my heart. And I would love for more semantics to be in this conversation. But it's a great suggestion to say that, okay, let's have an operationalization of semantic complexity. And I'm sure there could be a way of doing that. And we might see if that has an effect or not, and how that changes the model. I don't want to get your hopes up because I think there are some interesting variables that on some occasion or other I played around with, and then in the end, it maybe allows us to improve the classification accuracy by 0.02% or something like that. But that's okay. I mean, it's all interesting to pursue these questions in that way. Thank you for your question.
So since we don't yet have a online question, so we can take another offline. So, Ginger, please.
Hi, Martin. Thank you for your fantastic presentation. And I want to ask a question about compositionality.
Okay.
Yeah, since constructionalization increase the productivity and schematicity and compositionality. And today's presentation is about the lexeme-specific variability and the comparative constructions. And my question is, is there any threshold at which the semantic deviation is to be formation into another nodes in the construction network? And how can we determine is exactly the threshold that trigger that the creation of another node?
Okay. Yeah. Excellent question. I don't think that I can give you a precise answer for that. because so first of all, the exact point at which a speaker will come to represent a new construction as such, that is something that happens individually, right? So for any given speaker, the threshold might be somewhat different. Yeah? So you have speakers that have very high metalinguistic awareness, and they might notice something that's different and create a separate generalization for that and come to represent that. And then other speakers might just, work with broader categories, or might parse the language that they hear in the way that it's more shallow and not as deep enough. So I think it's difficult to give a precise measure for, this is a threshold where a new construction comes into being, or where a new meaning comes into play. So the interesting question to my mind is how we could measure that in the first place. So what kind of usage patterns we would expect to see at the moment when speakers have come to represent a new construction as such. And so the classic behavioral evidence, I would say, is that as soon as speakers start using constructions in contexts that would have been impossible given their earlier meanings. So what in grammaticalization studies have been called bridging contexts and isolating contexts. So in an isolating context, then indicate that, okay, the construction is used in a new way that was not possible beforehand. There you can be sure. But of course, much earlier than that already, the speaker would have represented a new construction as such. It's just at that moment that we catch it first.
Is there any possible a process of partial compositionalization? And well, there can be a lot of compositionalization, and since compositional constructionalization always shows the coexistence of the construction maintenance as something over that. And Trogut and Trussell suggest that we are in the process of the constructionalization. There can be some loss of composition. So what do you think of this?
Yeah. So I don't know if I agree with Trogut and Trussell in the idea that there always needs to be a loss of compositionality. It's true that in many cases that is a consequence of constructionalization. So there is a natural tendency for that to happen. What I'm less sure about is whether it always needs to happen, and whether it is an unavoidable tendency of unavoidable consequence of constructionalization. So it seems to me that even when we have constructionalization, transparency can persist for a long time before idiosyncratic traits and non-compositional meanings can develop, or let's say before compositionality disappears or disintegrates.
Transparency between the overall meaning of the construction and the partial meaning.
Thank you for your questions. Yeah, that's a question over there. Sorry, one here. Sorry.
Okay.
Hi, Martin. My name is Moni, and I have a question for you guys. In your concluding remarks, you said that schematic constructions and the specific constructions compete against each other. Well, we know that some specific constructions, just like siblings, or we say that they have sisterhood relationship.
Yeah.
Just as Lakoff said that they can explain, they can denote the similar meaning.
Yeah.
But how can schematic constructions compete with them with the specific constructions?
Okay. Well, you're right, of course, in saying that the competition always happens at the lateral level, right? So there's an instantiation that is vertical, so to speak, and competition that happens at the horizontal level. So that is what I wanted to say. Maybe I expressed that in a way that was less than 100% clear.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I will think it over. Thank you for your
Sure.
explanation.
Sure.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. And I have one question concerning the regression modeling and data frequency. So if the usage frequencies of the two or more linguistic variants we want to compare are indeed imbalanced, especially in some diachronic studies. So where the frequency of one variant may be 2 or 3 times that of another, and sometimes the low frequency structure only have a few dozen instances due to its maybe recent emergence during a specific historical period.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, can we still conduct regression modeling under these circumstances? So will the final results be affected due to this data imbalance?
Yeah. So will the results be? Thank you very much for your question. Will the results be impacted? Yes. So the margin of error will become larger. Yeah. But if the general tendencies are clear enough, then a small number of observations doesn't need to keep you from conducting a quantitative analysis. So, in a sense, what I had here is something of a special case. So it's a highly unbalanced data set. So I don't think that I've had a stronger imbalance than what we have here in work that I've done. But of course, there's also a lot of data, which is a luxury. So the data that is there provides a strong enough signal for the statistical analysis to have more than it actually needs. Yeah. So you don't need to have thousands and thousands of examples for regression analyses. Generally, the more imbalanced the data set is, the more likely it will be that an effect is not recognized as such, or an effect is maybe recognized, but the model gives you error margins that are large, so that what the model tells you is, look, I think there might be something, but it could also be due to chance. So there is nothing lost in applying a quantitative analysis and seeing what it gives you. It just might be that you need to be that the model indicates to you that conclusions about effect strength will be relatively tentative. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, personally, I also have a question. So, as third sections, so why this word like likely and so unique and particulars? Because it's if we talk about frequent
adjectives there are a lot. So I just wondering if there are, for example, diachronic motivations, or it's for example, like cultural aspect and communication needs, something like that. It's just curious about how this may evolve.
Yeah. So I'm afraid I don't have a really profound or very intelligent answer to that. There is, of course, an element of chance to the adjectives that become frequent in a given construction and become also entrenched for one of the two variants. As you say, communicative needs or thematic biases may lead to certain ideas being expressed more often than others. So, yeah, evidently speakers have a need to talk about likelihoods well, likely is perhaps one of the prime meanings where degrees are really, really important. So is there just a slight probability? Is there a very strong probability? So, well, it would be a highly, highly gradable adjectives, and that would mean it's naturally attracted to the comparative construction. Would I be able to predict that on the basis of first principles? Maybe not. So there are also other gradable adjectives that are not as frequent. So, for example, heavy. But then again, I don't know if there are maybe speakers who very, very often speak about things that are more or less heavy. Maybe if you really like going to a fitness center and you're lifting weights, and you often speak about heavy things and things that are even heavier, then there might be a chance of these adjectives becoming more entrenched. So it's a mixture of everything, right? The general semantic characteristics of the adjectives, and then the cultural setting in which the construction is used. And also, at the end of the day, it's also a matter of, the kind of language that is represented in the corpus. So the kind of sampling that is done.
Yeah, yes, maybe the aurora is also should be taken into consider when we seeing this particular from.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your
So we have your questions. Please. Thank you for your insightful presentation. I also have a question for you. I think that second language English learners choices between these two structures, the use of ER versus more comparatives may differ from the tendencies observed in native speakers.
Yeah.
And I believe that a more in-depth analysis includes corroborating more language use. Cases from non-native speakers might be necessary, this could potentially reveal other unexpected influencing factors. So I wonder, what do you think might be the implications of the research I mentioned for the study of constructional competition?
Yeah, excellent question. So I haven't tested how well this analysis translates to data from language learners. So it might be very interesting to test how well the model based on the BNC accounts for data that have been produced by second language learners. And if there are systematic differences, so that, for example, some variables play out in different ways in learner data. I would not be surprised if they did. So, for example, I could imagine that, first of all, learners might be overusing the more variant simply because it's more salient and more more visible and more transparent. So these are things that learners like. Yeah, that's something that we know. And I'm also quite certain that learners, that would be at the level of individual differences, that learners also show these lexically specific variabilities. So learners are known to be attached to patterns that are known as teddy bears. So something that you know very well and that you keep using. And so I could imagine that if a learner has heard a certain combination of more plus adjective, that they adopt this into their repertoire and that they are then overusing that, even in contexts where, let's say, one speakers of English would vary in a more balanced way between more and the ER suffix, and that they would eventually recover from that so that they converge on the patterns of usage that experienced users of the language exhibit. But in general terms, I think your comment is very, very valuable and on point. So learners will converge to some degree with the tendencies that I've described, but they will also deviate from them. And finding out exactly how they deviate, that's a very worthwhile enterprise. So I might look into that.
And how much do you need to?
Thank you very much. It's very long hours. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, sorry, sure.
So. Wasn't there some questions? Fine, so let's call it a day and thank you all for joining this meeting.